SS Culture, Volume 6, Early Germanic Man, translated from original SS publications. Introduction. The articles are about early Germanic man, starting around 3000 BC, and his pre-Christian thought and values. They are arranged in the chronological order of the SS magazine issues where they appeared, ranging from Volume 5 in 1939 to Volume 10 in 1944. German leadership. The fate of the folk depends on the greatness and goodness of its leadership. In it are expressed the revolutionary forces of courage, of will, and of yearning. Timeless and eternal is the validity of the laws to which it is bound, which determine its action. Only men of daring and dangerous, restless go-getters, who are never satisfied with the fulfillment of short-term goals, are destined for leadership. They must never lose that creative restlessness. After each victory, they must tighten the helmet and take off for new battles and more difficult, beckoning goals. Where such forces were at work in history, the history of our nation was shaped. Where they were lacking, and with them the courageous purpose into the future, then periods of weakness and lack of history broke upon our folk. But after each plunge, and yet before the folkish strength collapsed into bleak renunciation, they were again elevated by new leadership to a new goal, and led along the difficult path to a new rise. The history of our folk is the history of its leaders. Whoever wants to understand history and learn from it must penetrate to the springs from which it flows. The concentration and alignment of all folkish energies and their united utilization in the service of a higher community on the foundation of leadership and following were not just reborn from the National Socialist worldview after the inner political impotence and division of the post-war period, rather simply reawakened by it. For the leader idea lies deep in the essence of German man. It is at the same a law that lies in the blood, a life expression bound by kind and race, that is permeated by the will toward order in the community and corresponds to the deep inner need to put life in the service of a cause or a work. It alone gives the individual the justification of existence within the framework of the whole and enables, as community-forming element, the concentration of the folkish values toward interior and exterior accomplishments. Without the organic unity of leader and following, no national or social great deeds of historic substance are to be expected from Germanic men. At all times of our folkish rise, such great deeds stood at the peak, up to which we can look, full of admiration and pride. Their accomplishment, however, always rests on the voluntary and trusting affirmation of the personality of the leadership of the community. Every genuine leadership in the Germanic German sense comes from below, from the folk, and grows upward through the strength of personality, through talent and ability. This natural selection process reaches far back into the Germanic early period of our folk and corresponds to the political thought of the Germanic peasant, which expanded from the individual and his business to the community. in ever wider circles to the folks and folk federations. The understanding for an organic coordination of all forces in such order blocks of the community, which emerged from the needs of everyday life, was awakened by the uniqueness of agricultural activity, in which all members are at work in common service, and just as the peasant administers the business as a part of the whole, stood at the top of the larger communities and folk federations as a leader, by whom all the units were united on the basis of a voluntary subordination, decisive for the community order. However, was not the will of the leader rather the self-administration of the free members? Bearer of all right was the folk. The leader had no legal power of his own. He was simply an agent of the folk and obligated to the self-administrative body to take full responsibility. The election or confirmation of the Germanic leader was determined by the aspect of his origin and his personal worth, in the quality of the blood of the clan from which the man came. Germanic Man saw a guarantee for his suitability to lead the community. Supplemental to this blood-based selection came the personality evaluation. What the blood-based descent promised in terms of the individual's virtues, character, and accomplishments was tested and measured in their action readiness and performance by the clan and community. Those are the two principles that together provided the measuring stick according to which Germanic men determined and affirmed their leaders. Not incorrectly, one has labeled Germanic life a comparison of men, in which ability and accomplishment are mutually weighed in order to be able to recognize the first men of the community. Only the best, noblest, bravest, and most honorable could be elevated as first among equals to leader. The Germanic leader did not rule over subjects. His relationship corresponded to an alliance and support pact between free men with equal rights. It was carried by voluntarism, self-confidence, and freedom pride, by the feeling of personal worth and the mutual ability for respect and responsibility. All rights and duties between leader and followers were reciprocal and extended beyond the purely practical, legal, economic, and political sides of life into the higher one of morality. As the leader made the right of his following his own, viewed its distress as his own, so did it view his honor as his own, his glory as his own, and perceived its injury or disgrace as that of the whole. Going into battle, writes the Roman historian Tacitus in his Germania, it is disgraceful for the leader to be excelled in courage, and disgraceful for the following not to match the leader's courage. To return from battle without the leader is a dishonor for life, an irremovable disgrace. To defend him, to protect him, even to assign one's own deeds to his glory is the most sacred obligation. The leaders fight for victory. The followers fight for the leader. In the womb of the clan was the spring of life. It was nourished by the hereditary seat, which was inseparable to the family. The field crops, the odal, formed for each full-blooded Germanic person, for the leader as well as for the followers. The life foundation since the folkish community consisted only of peasants. The peasant leaders were at the same time folk leaders. Their peasant nature was just as little lost by the collision with the Roman world and in constant life of the folk wandering as it could have been uprooted by warrior glory and battle lust. Unshakable, they held firm to their life task to maintain the freedom of the homeland and home soil and to protect the agricultural work. When Bodrical, the leader of the Amsivaria, while seeking land, met with the Roman rulers, he uttered the following words while looking up at the sun with raised arms. As heaven is to the gods, so be the earth given to men, and all land that has no master can be taken into possession by anyone. The Roman delegate misunderstood the legitimate demand of the Amsivaria. He only wanted to give land to their leader in order to win him as an ally. Bodricol, however, rejected such a demand as reward for treason with the words, "We can lack land to live, but not to die." From this attitude speaks the loyalty of the Germanic leader who feels bound, for better or worse, to his following and rather chooses death than to accept advantages that his folk must do without. Unforgettable are the names of the great Germanic folk leaders and their great political deeds. How strongly the folk consciousness already lived in them is shown by the words of Hermann the Cherusker. If they, Germanic men, prefer the homeland, the ancestors, and the old customs over being despots and new Roman colonies, then they follow him as leader to glory and freedom. When he later met his brother Flavius the Blonde, who stood in Roman service, he mocked the low reward for his servitude and spoke of the sacred rights of the fatherland, of freedom which they inherited from the ancestors. Towering is the statesman-like dignity and bearing with which Ariovist, the Germanic leader, met the Roman military commander Caesar. If I do not tell the Roman folk how it should use its right, then I do not have to allow myself to be hindered in putting to use my right by the Roman folk. If Caesar tells me he will not idly watch hostilities towards the Hadua, he should know. Nobody has yet fought me without being brought down. If Caesar so desires, he can fight. Then he will see what kind of heroes the undefeated Germanic men are. These words also express the same folk-conscious pride as the Führer's speech in Wilhelmshaven about the presumptuous intervention politics of the English in matters of German life and space formation. Although the Germanic state idea lacked the firm outward enclosure, the concept of state borders, and it hence lacked the unified thrust force outward, it was characterized interpolitically by a perfect justice and practical structure. The expansion of the community order across several tribes and folks was still more dependent on the state formative ability of individual leaders than on their feeling of relatedness. The Roman historian Velleius Paterculus thus reports of Marbod, the leader of the Marcomanni, that he did not gain rule by a coup de main or lucky coincidence. Rather, he decided, after he had firmly established his empire and assumed the power of king, and then led his folk far from the sphere of Roman power, to penetrate where he, withdrawing from more powerful weapons, could most powerfully employ his own. He took possession of the domain surrounded by the Hercynian forest and subjugated his neighbors through war or made them dependent through treaties. He brought the mass of those who defended his empire, who through constant exercise had almost achieved the firm organization of Roman discipline. In a short time, an exceptional height, worrisome even for our Roman Empire. When, however, Marbod elevated himself beyond folk leader and peasant leader to self-willed ruler, negotiated with the Romans and spoke for an expansion of their despotic rule, his proud Marcomannan Empire fell apart in the war against the Cherusca, fighting for their old glory and the newly won freedom. Tacitus reports about this in his Annals. The strength of both folks, the ability of their leaders were equal, but Marbod's title of king made him hated among his own countrymen, while Herman, stood in favour as champion of freedom. The folkish resistance was not directed at kingship itself, which is after all a Germanic manifestation, rather only against the overreaching kingly power, and hence most of Marbod's troops went over to his opponent Herman in order to fight for their old rights and freedoms. Throughout the whole Germanic period, up into the Middle Ages, weaves like a red thread the revolt of folkish bound leadership against rulers perceived to be degenerate, who are no longer folk leaders, the first among equals, rather rulers over subjects who want to thwart the old order and freedom. Julius Civilis, the leader of the Bataver, coined this Germanic freedom consciousness in the proud words, "May Syrians, Asia Minor, and the Orient, accustomed to kings, preserve in their servitude. In Gaul still live many who were born before the land was subjected to tribute. A sense of freedom is given to dumb animals by nature, but manly virtue, on the other hand, is an original possession of man, and the gods are favourable to the one who has the greatest courage." The external enclosure of the Germanic community order only manifested itself in the course of extraordinary events. It achieved its greatest extent during foreign political events, during the acquisition of land and military campaigns. Here the leader tasks extended far beyond the routine and demanded, in addition to bravery and courage, special political talent, cleverness, and prudence. The best suited among a large number of smaller community leaders was lifted on a shield at a land assembly. They selected their military leader based on courage, reports Tacitus. For among Germanic men, one inspires the more confidence, the more daring he is. In times of unrest, he is hence considered the stronger. The military leaders lead more by example than by power. When, ready for the deed, visible to all, they charge far ahead of the battle line, through the admiration that they awaken. In war as in peace, the Germanic leader was seen as an example of ability and accomplishment. Even through the authority of his office was greater in times of war and turmoil, the following more tightly organized by him and their total readiness to the death demand. The leader's power was still not unlimited, for the greater right just grew greater duties. The follower owed his leader less obedience than loyalty. That was the binding element between them, the foundation of the mutual duty relationship. If the leader became disloyal, he forfeited the claim to the obedience of his following. For German man was obligated to obedience only insofar as loyalty demanded it. Despotism and blind obedience were alien to him. The purely human relationship between leader and following is only healthy and true to kind if it is determined by friendship and comradeship and does not grow beyond the natural distance caused by greater accomplishments and its affirmation. It is a mistake, however, to confuse this natural distance present with every genuine leader with lack of spirit of comradeship. Where the distance is lacking and a plump familiarity dominates, the leader is also lacking. Whoever stands in that position is indeed an equal among equals, but not the first among equals. The leader must share joy and suffering with his following and be joined with them in good days and bad, for better or worse. He must, however, always keep his bearing, be an example in the best sense, avoid excesses and indiscipline, maintain proportion and respect good morals. These characteristics are an expression of the essence of German man, especially of the peasant, who can preserve his prestige among family members and subordinates, with whom he lives closely under one roof, only through distance, through dignity and bearing. In genuine leadership, the sure feeling for this distance is alive as Germanic blood legacy. It cannot be lost in any life situation and forbids showing emotion in front of the following. Every genuine Germanic German community of law manifests itself through the widespread participation of all the free men in the political life and through the small social distance between the leadership and the folk. The blissful expansion of this elemental principle shows itself at the present time in life proximity of our national socialist state, whose structure is based on the clear recognition of our folkish kind. If the Nordic peasant Aki can reply to his king in the home assembly, Heimskringla, if I am your man, king, then you are also my man. Then he expresses the same thing that we still feel today, namely, that the relationship between leader and following rests on the personal and mutual obligation of loyalty and support. Germanic leadership was not only active in war and struggle, rather also in the homeland's peace, in jurisprudence and morality, in honor, rest, order, and in prosperity. The external enclosure proceeded in this time, for in peace, so reports Caesar, there is no Germanic ruling class, rather the chiefs of the lands and provinces pronounce right among their people and settle disputes. Whether these leaders of the closer communities belong to the Germanic blood nobility or whether they were larger, free peasants is unimportant for their characteristics. In old Nordic sources, they are generally called chieftains or foremen, the first of the area, or those who have the direction of the district, while their following is called a thing people. Such thing communities were jurisprudence and administrative units. Their leaders were considered on the basis of their origin, their personal accomplishments, and honor ableness. first among equals, and they form the weight-bearing pillar of the political order and the communal structure. This relationship of thing and leadership from which the political form of the community developed is in the best sense a fortunate blending between a democratic rule by the folk and aristocratic nobility rule principle. Next to military leadership in war, the tasks of the Germanic leader extends to religious ceremonies, jurisprudence, and administration. As first among equals, the leader was also the one most called on to perform consecration ceremonies in public and to direct the great cult festivals. For Germanic leadership extends all encompassing to all of life that has not yet suffered division in faith, morality, and law. Even the knowledge of the holy things was not reserved to special medicine men, rather common property, and consecrations are performed both by every peasant in his farmyard community and by the leader at the thing. Within jurisprudence, only the authority over assembly, calling, and conducting the thing assembly fell to the leader. At the actual legal judgment, on the other hand, he had only minor influence, for pronouncing judgment and passing laws was the matter of the thing assembly. The leader was, so reports Tacitus, listened to in the council in accordance with the age of the speaker, his noble origin, his war glory, but mostly in accordance to his reputation, not any authority to command. If his suggestion did not find favour, they rejected it by murmuring. If they agreed, they clapped their spears together. The most honourable form of applause came through the clang of weapons. Only through knowledge of law was the leader able to get his way, to preserve the right of the thing people, and to guarantee their protection. Therefore, in old Nordic sources, knowledge of law is especially emphasized. For example, in the Njala, a mighty chieftain and great legal support, so knowledgeable in law that no judgments were considered rightful if he had not been present. Skapti and his father were great chieftains and very knowledgeable of the law. Knowledge of the laws, helpfulness, honesty, and far-sightedness proved just as lasting as war glory. They formed, in that time, when there was still no state peace and no neutral judicial system, rather just self-help and feud, a peaceful way to settle disputes and preserve the community's order through honourable settlements and judgments. The importance of right and law for Germanic peace are revealed in the words of the great Nordic legal leader, Njal. Through law, our land is built, but through unlaw, desolated. Germanic Man voluntarily placed himself under the protection and direction of the leader. They expected friendly aid from him, not just in word and advice, rather also through energetic economic support. If failed harvests or other calamity put them in distress, in the old Germanic sagas, the generous leader is called the most popular man in the district, or one of the noblest in the heathen time. The human relationship between leader and following corresponded to a support pact, which was filled with genuine comradeship, spirit, and subject to the feeling of obligation to help wherever needed. The custom also existed, so reports Tacitus, to voluntarily and from man to man to deliver a portion from their herds and harvests to the leader, a practice that was felt to be honourable and at the same time helped in emergency. As the leader gave, so did he receive. The gifts flowing to him were considered communal property for services that were entrusted to his reliable hand and administered by him in a patriarchal manner. For the follower, the delivery of the contributions was voluntary. He gave no forced services or forced taxes to the leader, rather friendly services and friendly gifts, as is common among free men and equals. Under Germanic leadership are not just the direction of the district and the guidance of jurisprudence and administration in the external sense to be understood, rather also leadership in the area of morality. It represented living an example according to the laws that were generally recognized as moral values. The supreme moral law was life in honor, to which the leader subordinated himself more than any other person. For Germanic man of the early period, honor was of fateful importance. It gave him the measuring stick with which he could himself measure his height in life and uniqueness, and at the same time it was in public judgment the testing stone of his proving himself, his ability, and his value for the community. On honor depended the individual's feeling about himself and his exaltation, his self-consciousness, and his personality value. It determines his reputation as well as his political and social position. It was just as tied to his own conscience as to the judgment of the public, and was very generally viewed as the accepted law under which the life of men was placed, and by which it was judged. For the fulfillment of the law of honor on the side of the leader, the community felt it was called upon as a judge. Before it, the leader had to present and defend his honesty, for the leader's honor was also that of the following. But if it or the honor of the comrade was injured, then that of the whole community was injured, and all had the duty to wash it clean again. The leader stood out by the greater measure of honor and glory from the following, and by his moral influence on the community. To these moral values belonged heroic bearing, courage and will to self-assertion, the feeling of his own dignity and responsibility before himself, and the totality and the unconditional fulfillment of duty toward the community entrusted to him. Beyond that, praised were the special leadership virtues of nobility, generosity, liberality, and constant readiness for support of the needy with advice and deed. All these leadership characteristics and leadership virtues are not bound by time. They do not only characterize the community structure of the Germanic ancestors, rather, they very generally determine, timeless in their validity, the essential traits of the genuine leadership of Nordic kind itself. To share them, to aspire to them, means for us the noblest action, for leaders are always lacking. Men who cannot live without goal and struggle, without yearning and restlessness, in whom the creative energy is alive, and who are called upon through self-discipline to lead other men. Our generation stands alone in the passing present. We must first laboriously reacquire again the knowledge of the ancient life laws of our folkish existence, which has been denied the direct path of natural passing down. The immediate past up to the outbreak of the World War only shows us satisfied and calm generations who sunned themselves in their lack of history and avoided struggle. From the hollowness of their life we can gain no strength, for we stand today on the threshold of a new world. We must seek untrodden paths, and with daring courage stride into the darkness of the future. We must seek the measuring stick for our existence at the clear source of our folkish evolution. In the Germanic early period, and choose their struggling figures and leaders as fate-related companions for our dangerous life. We are an alert and creative generation that cannot live without its historic ties and the brothers of fate of the past. Whoever today raises claim of leadership must know the essence of leadership is in historic linkage, must be permeated with the high responsibility downward and upward toward past and future, must guard himself against self-satisfied superiority of rank, and be filled with the flaming Germanic defiance that rebels against all obstacles and overcomes them. SS Hushtuff, Ernst Schaper, SS Lightheft, Year 5, Issue 2, May the 15th, 1939. Sunstones, victory stones, soul stones, holy symbols on fossils. If somebody places a shell into our hand that does not radiate the fresh colours of the shells of the North Sea and other seas, rather is a light grey stone that resembles a shell in shape only, then each of us knows what that is, a fossil. Unfortunately, only seldom does somebody know where and how one finds such fossils. He, the nature alien city person, only knows them from museums. Nonetheless, they are interesting. They are witness to how the world, animal and plant world, looked like millions of years ago. It was different with our ancestors. For them, forest and field and mountain were still their daily living space, and so they naturally also knew about fossils because they found them at certain places on open cliffs or in gravel or in crop fields, and they naturally also thought about them. We can provisionally determine from their use and the many finds that our ancestors thought about such stones as images. Above all, they thought about the strange forms, and even more about the figures and lines impressed on the stones, and they adopted these forms in their world of thought, so that they, in part, served the world of the gods, and in part, human needs. An ammonite, for example, whose windings resemble the spiral of a coiled snake, seem to them to have a secret connection to really living snakes. The divided scales of a large shell from the Dachsteinkalk, which looks much like a horse track, are viewed in Styria, even today, as the tracks of the white horse rider Woden, and the similar cross-sections resembling goat or bird tracks are viewed as the tracks of the wild woman by the people in the Enns Valley. Certain other fossils resemble, in form and design, a flying dove. The beautiful star corals from Franconia show shining stars in their cross-section. All of these conspicuous symbols must have had led to an idea whether nature did not want to thereby give man certain clues as to how these stones would be useful. It was, after all, long a principle in folk medicine that similar is healed by similar, so one also used plants with knotty shapes, stocked to heal broken bones. Peasants in northern Germany, whose cows gave bloody milk, put snow-white, petrified sea urchins from the chalk into the milk pails in order to get the milk white again, due to their magical colour. Sunwheel stones, Boniface pennies, Surrounded by sagas and customs are above all the sunstones, or as they are still called today in northern Germany, the sun wheel stones. Science sees in them the stalk members of the petrified sea lily Henricus, which are very common in Germany's shell chalk. This shell chalk from the Trias Formation is found in Franconia, Thuringia, and Lower Saxony, and during weathering thousands of these tiny, hardly penny large, disc shaped stalk members fall off, showing a hole in the center. From this hole radiates on both surfaces of the little disc lines which actually resemble a small sun. It is not surprising that precisely such shell chalk mountains in Thuringia, Hesse, and Hanover, where sunstones are abundantly found, had been old Germanic cult sites. The most famous of these cult mountains is Hulfensberg by Geismar in Hesse. At the slope of the mountain also stood that famous Donau oak, which Boniface, in fantastical fervour, had cut down when Christianity was introduced, and which a truck piece has remained preserved to this day in the Franciscan church at the Hulfensberg. Franciscan churches today stand on many of these old cult sites, and they were erected there in order to exterminate old memories, or at least to form a transition to Christianity. And so sun stars, too, which are found as numerous today as earlier, since the conversion known as Boniface pennies have remained. The church, however, appears to have placed these fines under compulsion to turn over. For the peasants, one asks about them shyly, shake their hands, and claim to have never heard anything about such a thing. Old peasants, shown such pennies, even think one should immediately take these pieces to the pastor and must not keep them. More proof of how severely the church worked for the extermination of the belief in the sun wheel stones. The shape of the sun wheel stones, furthermore, is also copied in a pastry, which is today still sold to the pilgrims travelling to Hulfensberg for the time of Christ's ascent into heaven. This use of food is perhaps connected to the fact that the genuine sunwheel stones were given in powdered form to sick people or animals to cure them. The teeth of the moonwolf, Managama. The terrible bite with its hundreds of triangular teeth displayed by sharks today was also already possessed by the sharks of earlier eras, and their teeth still exist fossilized in many layers of the Earth's crust. In Germany, it is especially the teeth of the giant shark from the late Tertiary era that are abundantly found in the soil. Our ancestors probably saw them in the teeth of the moonwolf, Managama, which must have broken off during his monthly devouring of the moon. According to their belief, after all, the moon is constantly pursued and hunted by the moonwolf, just as the sun is by the sunwolf. When the moonwolf manages to catch up to the moon and gradually devour it, one can imagine that he loses many of his teeth during these big bites, which then fall to the earth. That also explains why the moon wolf that we find portrayed on a pillar capital of the Stiftskirche in Berchtesgaden very clearly bears large triangular shark teeth in his mouth and not a wolf's mouth, roughly resembling our dogs. And in France's soil, a probably Celtic coin was found whose reverse side exactly displays the scene with the moon wolf, indeed quite crude, but clear enough in order to recognize how the moon man is being eaten by the moon wolf. Victory stones, the stones with the sacred symbols, the ammonite horns or other spiral snail shells must have been known since very ancient times. Also the petrified sea urchins that are especially plentiful in northern Germany, but which have already been dragged far to the south since the Ice Age. Many of them are even translucent or transparent. Jacob Grimm reports of a saying in an old song about this. Other forms of fossilized sea urchins appear to have a deep connection to soul belief. We occasionally find them in prehistoric graves from the Bronze Age to the early Middle Ages, and can imagine that the grooves, which usually evenly divide the stone by 5, aroused mythical thoughts in our ancestors. Even at the start of the 18th century, the collection of Albert Ritter in Ilfeld contained such a sea urchin on whose upper surface the grooves have been artificially deepened to produce a druid cross pentagram. And even today, Czech peasants give such stones the Czech name Duchenek. Dutch means soul in Czech. We should not lightly dismiss such belief or our ancestors as superstition. How could they, without microscope and chemistry, explain phenomenon that we children of our time have also only a few decades? We know today that animals of past eras left behind their prints here. Our ancestors could not know that. They could only closely observe and think, and that they did, that they did. That should indeed have been made clear to everybody from this, our review. This work is based on material from Professor Abel and his book, quote, Prehistoric Animal Remains in German Myth, Custom and Faith and Belief. Jena, Gustav Fischer, 1939. SS Leitheft, Year 7, Issue 3b. The Honor of Germanic Woman. One rightly recognizes the main point of Germanic morality and Germanic life content in the feeling of honor and the consciousness of honor. For the people of the Germanic early period, honor is the law of life, of fateful importance, the measuring stick by which one measures one's own life, height, and one's own value. It is at the same time, however, insofar namely as it always and everything stands under public judgment, the testing stone for his proving himself, his ability, and his value for the community. The social, political position also depends on how far the law of honor is fulfilled by the individual. Honor means inner, personal feeling of self and exaltation, self-consciousness, personality value, and community value. Each has as much honor as he measures on himself. In this double-sidedness, in the blending of the own conscience with the public judgment, honor is recognized as the commonly accepted law under which Germanic human life is placed, according to which it is judged. That means nothing other than that Germanic man fully placed himself under an idea, under an immaterial spiritual value, which the spiritual uniqueness of Germanic blood has given itself. Honor is a person's highest possession. It is the thing that first gives him validity, in a sense, first makes him a human. The person without honor does not count in the Germanic community. Honor is more than life, which the vivacious peasant treasured so much. Rather die with honor than live with disgrace. Better, it seems to me, to lose you than to have a son without honor. Property perishes, clans die, one day you too die, but I know one thing that never perishes, the glory won by the dead. The narrow, obligating, and right bestowing bound of all blood kin, which makes the affairs of the individual to those of the clan, and those of the clan to those of the individual, naturally do not deviate in their property and law from this principle. If the honour of a clansman is injured, so is that of all also injured, and all have the duty to wash it clean again. That actually already says the Germanic woman, too, has a share in the highest life possession of Germanic people. We cannot, however, satisfy ourselves with this general determination. That is self-evident to the person who lives in the old Germanic world, but will be impossible for the person who cannot free himself from Oriental worldview. We are concerned about all the questions, how far women have endeavoured for this Germanic life law and starting point for all morality, how she realized it through her life, defended it, and kept it alive, how she lived in honor. Honor is the common ideal for woman and man. Our sources speak as precisely about the honorableness of the woman as of that of the man. It is important that they use the same word for the woman with honor consciousness as for the man, and hence here too make no distinction between man's honor and woman's honor. Man and woman are called Drenga Goda, honor person. Actually, upright and honor conscious fellow of the Old North, we find the roots of the Drenga Goda ideal at a deeper level than in an escalation of so-called manly characteristics. Above all, however, it appears important to us that this ideal honorableness, this being in possession of honor, is placed as a demand on both genders and also finds its fulfillment in both and is developed by both. Those of us who make the effort to remove from our speech and our thought such alien terms that separate life forms into male and female, at least view this formulation of this interpretation as dangerous. We believe we must get serious and clear away the view that ascribes male to all courage, discipline, breeding, and honor. Only Western and Oriental thought limits us to such a perspective. Germanic early history, however, shows that Germanic peasant women were filled with the same bravery, the same courage, love of freedom and self-discipline as their men. That they also were ready at every moment to risk their lives for such values. Not only the women of the Kimber and Teutons, Armborough and Tipperina, whose fearless bravery in the Roman war, wild love of freedom and passionate feeling of honour has been immortalized forever, even by the enemy, have provided proof of their manly characteristics. Rather also those Germanic peasant women whose lives did not stand under the spotlight of great political events. They too were often compelled, just by their kind of life, the loose band of the community that knew no general peace and the dependence of the clan on their strength. To think and act strongly and bravely for the clan, they had to subordinate their own wishes to the welfare of the clan and practice self-discipline. Thus we dare not label as male or female that spirit of courage and discipline, that spirit of honourableness, since we see it alive, equally strong in both genders. We also do not dare to wrongly insult our ancestral mothers as unwomanly, because they showed manly virtues. We also, however, cannot follow those interpretations that want to ascribe the Drenga spirit to the male alone. Just the knowledge of Germanic Weltview, community, order, and personality, valuation alone, which are not bound to gender, cannot let us be surprised when again and again, next to the man dying for honour, Germanic peasant women step forward who are filled with the same honour consciousness. It is obvious that a folk which attributes something sacred and ominous to its woman cannot take away what in Germanic eyes first makes a complete person, honour. Important, on the other hand, appears to us that in the course of development an Oriental worldview gradually silences the Germanic kind of woman's honour, or gives it a different content. Woman's honour becomes, in accordance with the Oriental life feeling, solely a physical sexual matter, and eventually it means just physical virginity and being untouched. Concepts are switched here. In motherhood lies the highest honour of the woman. Naturally, chastity is demanded in Germania as well, but first, this demand applies to both genders, and second, its reason is essentially different than that of the Oriental life commands. Having had intercourse with a woman before the age of 20, they consider extremely shameful. The ones who maintain their chastity the longest raise the highest praise from their own. They believe that this promotes body size and that strengthens and sinews are formed. Caesar's words reveal that the North did not make chastity a life value due to a strange valuation of the natural as sin, or due to fear of entanglement in sexual excesses, which poses a far greater danger for the Oriental mentality than for the cooler blood of the North. Furthermore, they show that he does not confuse it with the idea of honour. The violation of chastity up to a certain age, or more openly stated, sexual intercourse in too early youth, was considered in Germania to be a spiritual and physical endangerment of a person. It meant a dulling of the perfection ideal of people and a threat to other Germanic life principles. Behind the demand for the sexual purity of the physically and spiritually immature person stands the will to, on the one hand, not endanger the purity and strength of blood, and on the other hand, the general moral principle of self-discipline, which was valid for the whole life of Germanic man. Out of responsibility toward the blood, which one should pass along in equal strength to the descendant, and out of responsibility toward oneself, toward the personality value, which is carried by personal dignity and self-respect. Chastity is demanded from immature persons in Germania. If, on the other hand, Germanic man has reached full maturity in body and soul, then it is for him obvious not to act contrary to the law of creation and the traits nature gave him through his own sick, twisted sense, in that he prevents their fertility and their own eternal will to rejuvenate by means of protracted chastity. Not against nature and its laws does Germanic man live, rather with it. He does not let the gifts it gave him degenerate due to a humanly mistaken evaluation. Rather, he sees in their development first the full fulfillment of man, which nature made man or woman, but not a genderless neutral. Thus the demand for an exaggerated prolonged chastity and the declaration of an abstinent celebrate life as that of higher mankind. Initially encountered total incomprehension in Germania. Yes, it must even be perceived as resistance and violation of the eternal life law itself. Chastity is hence just a conditional demand for the life conduct for Germanic man, but not an absolute that stands without restriction over the whole life conduct of a person. Virgin and monk are not Germanic examples, are not higher valued people. Rather, since they have not yet fully developed the given strengths, more the opposite. This concept of the conditional, only for the immature person, obligatory value of chastity is valid for man and woman in Germania, that virginity, being untouched, is by no means decisive for the woman. Yes, that it is not even taken into consideration by the evaluation of the free Germanic woman is proven most convincingly by the penalties for woman for cohabitation and manslaughter. Swabian folklore says cohabitation with a married woman is to be penalized twice as much as with a virgin. Thus, not virginity, chastity, and being untouched set the value of the damage. Salian, Ripvarian, and Thuringian law books set as manslaughter penalty for a fertile woman, or for one that has already started to bear children, 3 times the penalty as for a not yet fertile virgin. Precisely these legal statements, where the distinction between virgin, virgo, and woman, mulia, are articulated, make it quite clear that the concept of virginity is meaningless in terms of valuation of woman, that one does not even think about it, for the killing of a woman is deemed 3 times the damage as that of a virgin. Not the chastity, rather the biological value of the woman, which, as opposed to the task of virginity, is made dependent on fulfillment of motherhood, are decisive for the valuation of the woman. The Germanic view of the only conditional value of chastity cannot be made more clear than here. The bearing woman, the mother, whose conception can never be a blemish, receives the higher value in Germania, because she fulfills the life law for herself and for her folk. The personal value of the woman, however, depends, as has already been emphasized, on her traits, accomplishments, and her character, on her soul and heart, spirit, and disposition. Where does this valuation of chastity as a moral concept come from? How could being untouched in the moral sense even be equated with woman's honor? We remember that the Germanic woman's ideal, Germanic holy women, were always mothers and grandmothers, Frigg, Frau Holle, that according to Germanic feeling, conception was no flaw, no blemish, and no devaluation, rather that such an interpretation would be deemed an insult against Germanic mothers. We experience in the sagas 100-fold that widows are just as desired as young girls, and no Germanic person gets the idea that a widow has less value because she is no longer untouched. Jewish Oriental spirit, on the other hand, finds the virgin more desirable than the woman. The term desirable is intentionally chosen here, for the higher valuation of the virgin based on Oriental feeling originally probably had hardly any moral basis. When the present holy book of Islam, the Quran, again and again promises as reward to faithful Muslim men paradisical gardens, virgins who have not been touched by any man or spirit for their pleasure, that shows that the chastity of woman must actually have a special value for the Oriental, since they are, after all, reserved for him, so to speak, as reward and joy of paradise. Virginity, being untouched, just cannot be a moral value. Rather, it must have been a sensual one, in the Garden of Eden. For the chastity of the woman has, after all, only the one meaning, that she is promised to the man who destroys it in that highest life of pleasure in the beyond, the possession of black-eyed virgins like pearls in the clam, the divine reward of the faithful in paradise, clearly says that the chastity of the Oriental woman is only demanded for the greater enjoyment of the man. We have hence found for which race the chastity of the woman plays such a conspicuous role in what actually lies behind this demand. Germanic man, however, would have hardly come up with the concept of a virgin mother, and would also not have been able to see a higher value in her. His goddesses and the woman he finds dear and high have motherly features and are mothers. Motherliness downright elevates them. When now in the course of an intervening foreign valuation the Virgin Mother of God displaces Germania's motherly deities, when the nun is set higher than the Germanic clan mother, and the higher valuation of virginity over motherliness and motherhood is hammered into Germanic man so long until he accepts it into his view of morality, then we can therein measure the whole depth of the violent disruption of Germanic worldview and the mighty destabilization of sure Germanic life feeling. What a rupture in Germanic man must this alien view have caused, ripped out a vicarious worldview, so that girls of an entire village took the veil, as has been reported. In peasant morality, the Germanic concept of honor lives on. Peasant morality in the country, even today, does not look like it is desired by the new teachings. Even today, the old customs live with old strength, which were once born from a different native morality, a morality that could not be brought into harmony with the later thought of foreign thought. Despite all threats of hellfire and purgatory, windowing has remained an accepted right of young people among the southern German tribes, and nobody would think to declare it sinful. Even the authorities who feel called upon to be guardians and judges of morality overlook it. If not with understanding, then with impotence. Despite the fundamentally anti-mother Christian demand for chastity, it is not rare for young peasant girls to give their later husbands children even before the Christian blessing and marriage. But they are not therefore covered with shame and disgrace by the peasant people of their own kind among whom they live, and the premarital children are not viewed as tainted in sin. Only when a girl shows an inner want of principles is she rejected by the moral feelings of the community, but not because she cannot marry her child's father until after the birth. The alien Oriental chastity value has little to say here. Rather, the old Germanic moral law of the preservation of blood and inner discipline. So the loss of virginity even today is not always the same as loss of honor itself, just as little as in old Germania. Behind the demand for chastity in Germania stands the will, on the one hand, not to endanger the purity and strength of the blood, and on the other hand, the general moral principle of self-discipline, which is valid for the whole life of Germanic man. That is why chastity as life conduct is demanded in Germania too, but it is its own value next to honor, a possession whose loss under circumstances can lessen the woman's value, but does not equate to a loss of honor. Who would think to scold a Tordis Surstochter as being without honor? The judgment of the Germanic judge is not so dogmatically bound, rather considers the circumstances. The law books also reflect that, in that they first cancel the cohabitation penalties when a woman has slept with the fourth or fifth man, and her want of principles is hence proven. In the same direction points the fact that virginity never existed as an ideal in the old time. Yes, it can hardly have been a concept, for there is no word for it. Naturally, all of that ties together in that one viewed the task and the ideal of a fulfilled woman's life in motherhood. According to everything, it is clear that the chastity of immature people is just one conditional life value among others, but that honor is the highest life law. But chastity is not woman's honor. This narrowing, the result of an alien valuation that injures Germanic womanhood, opens shocking insights into those beating marriages that we encounter in the source material step by step from the Middle Ages onwards. But it also opens understanding for the decay symptoms that woman's life shows in the modern time. For what remains for the woman after her personality has been devaluated, when she is from the start as the source of all sin, as the physical and flesh-bound embodiment of the bad principle, contrasted to the spiritual, better male pole? What remains to her when she is, in addition to all that, removed from the firm band of the clan, and she is left to her sinful, guilt-ridden self, or enslaved to the man as her master? Where remain her self-consciousness, her freedom and responsibility, these prerequisites for all morality? But that he should be her master does not just mean the destruction of all Germanic woman's worth, the annihilation of any possibility of her independent cooperation in the formation of the folk community, and hence also the sick disarray of the community, of which woman is the other component, and of which she consists. Rather, it actually also means that the man assumes a monopoly of morality, that he so too speaks and becomes the master of morality. Indeed, he then also becomes decisive in questions of morality, morals, ethics, and whatever else one may call it, who then teaches her according to written down dogmatic principles. After one has taken from woman the sureness of her feeling for right and wrong, has more or less convinced her of her inferiority, and has designated as bad the morality given her by blood, it could naturally no longer be all too difficult to eliminate her from morality questions. Margareta Schäper Heckel, SS Leitheft, Year 9, Issue 11. How Did Our Ancestors Live? By Hans Friedrich Blunk. Part 1. Why we today know more about our ancestors. The science of the prehistory of the Occident, especially of the North, is actually not as young as many presume. Already in early church records, inexplicable gold and silver finds from the heathen times are mentioned, the author warning against researching them because it was obviously devil's gold with which he sought to tempt people. Sagas also report of treasures that, insofar as they are not coins, are portrayed as golden cauldrons or filled chests, no different than science later excavated them. One sometimes attributes them to skillful blacksmiths of earlier times, but usually the lucky finder is shy and measures the treasure's value by the melted down gold. What must have all been once buried underground if our sagas are even in just small part truth? The period of humanism then brings the first discussion about prehistory beyond the biblical portrayal. I wish to limit my portrayal to the minimum, but I think we need it in order to test ourselves in the image of our blotched self-feeling. Italy's rebirth, known as the Renaissance, which grew from its old history, takes a sidestep in Germany, which has given us much, but which did not have the strength to create anew from its own folk consciousness, and in so far as it is co-responsible for the spiritual end of the following centuries, the humanists, such as Conrad Keltis, tried to create the same concept for Germany next to the Italian work of Biondo. But one has no longer known himself for many centuries, and although we thank the new edition of Tacitus's Germania to Keltis, and even the writings of the Roswitha, his first lectures over German prehistory, which he held in Vienna, prove the impotence of the German world conception. Although Keltis no longer traces back the introduction of marriage and property to Christianity alone, he nonetheless claims that cultivation and cattle breeding were brought to wild Germanic men by the Celtic Druids driven out by Caesar, and the humanists' Trithemius fantasies of the Bavarians that they, under Duke Bogerin, driven out in the Trojan War, wandered northward, and after expulsion of the very coarse natives who lived like animals from acorns, surrender their land to his people. Crude falsifications followed, in no way second to those of the Scots and Czechs in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially since the open-minded Kaiser Maximilian worked for the collection of earlier documents of German history. Even these falsifications, however, never stem from the concept of an organic past, rather similar to those of the English who trace themselves to the 13th tribe of Judah. Always play with an ancestor world that must be drawn up from the greatest possible distance. The only thing one who brings something real into the new searching is Ulrich von Hutten, who at least realizes the importance of Arminius, and in a conversation with the dead, gives him a place between Hannibal and Alexander. Not one of them came up with the idea that the treasures appearing again and again from our soil were to be traced back to an earlier cultural bloom of our own. The amazement at finding something one has dug up in our soil, meanwhile, did not stop. A Silesian pastor, Hermann, 1670 to 1736, collects, as a chronicle explains, about 10,000 grave articles. Rulers have astounding discoveries reported. The German awakening in the 17th and 18th centuries connect the still ongoing coincidental excavations in their first dawning suspicion and research. Goethe reports in his Congenialities how people occupy themselves with puzzling over unknown prehistory. In 1814, Sweden even protects findings in the ground through a law. Among us, our folks flood by Latin, Spanish, French, and again Latin culture does not permit a really scientific researching and seeking to come up. At best, one's view of our prehistory sticks to the very valuable, but still filled with painful errors, portrayal by Tacitus. In 1806, Adelung still writes in his oldest history of the Germans, Germanic man is a predator who sleeps when he does not hunt or feed. Although Franz Bopp in 1833 and after him Grimm prove the earlier unity of the Indo-Germanic language and the worlds of the god, and hence the concept of wild barbarians should be shifted. And although the great Danish researcher Vorsager advanced his own folk's prehistory, The people trapped in the classical concept do not stir. Around the turn of the century, so relates Cosina, and one can confirm it from one's own experience. In our folk, the image of a dull-witted, predatory life of old Germanic man still predominates, which only ended when the Mediterranean cultures taught them obedience of law and crop cultivation, and the church brought them words of love and faith. In an otherwise highly important work of history, and these days I still read, as much as the Romans try to deal with them, quote unquote, Germanic people, they had to see that the wild nomads simply lacked the sense for voluntary integration into a life, territory established on duties and rights. It was often as if this elsewhere already dying concept of soul salvation from Asia before its end sought to once more defame our own past, which we do not even find in Roman accounts or their worst atrocity propaganda. Almost more dangerous, however, becomes the philosopher who misunderstands Nietzsche's blonde beasts and, with a tenacity unclouded by any doubt, sought them in their own country. We should not excuse such ignorance with a smile. Whoever publicizes a judgment should be conscious of the effect and should not blindly muddy his folk's reputation. He should inform himself of the general facts that are today available about the prehistory of the Indo-Germanic peoples and also their Germanic branch. He must know of the similarity of old faith concept that one could determine, as well as the emergence of the various groups from an already well-formed life culture and crop cultivation in light of early and passed down history. He must also know about the great period of Germanic blacksmith art that once led our continent, even if it later sank again from its splendor. For our neighbors, it is also a European matter to inform oneself about it, just like we Germans occupy ourselves with Etruscan, Greek, or Iberian art and take joy in it, or beyond that page through the Veda, a study from ancient Iran. One will object that the science of the prehistory of the North was scant long enough, that it primarily rested on research about the Scandinavians who far surpass us, and the objection is not without a justification. For a century long, one did not dare in Germany to abandon the old humanist concepts. In a manner that almost amuses us, one declared the puzzling finds in our soil first Celtic, then Phoenician, but never as homegrown. The important history teacher Matthias Koch wrote in the 1850s, quote, "For German lands, the rule is that the ancient relics of bronze and gold found in graves, if they are not Roman, must necessarily be Celtic, because it goes against cultural history to attribute them to the Germanic man. Graves whose utensils are entirely bronze are designated to be Celtic and will never be able to be designated otherwise." End quote. For several more decades, German research was hindered by the teachings of Lindenscheidt and Hostmann that all Bronze Period finds were supposedly Etruscan. Frenchmen, Danes, and Swedes have meanwhile performed the breakthrough work. Sophus Müller, Montelius, Vorsar are names of the North that we mention in gratitude and reverence. Already in 1840, the Frenchman Boucher de Perthes had unlocked for us the life of Ice Age man in Europe, and the Englishman Latham was first to claim in 1850 that the great Indo-Germanic culture was of North European origin. In Schleswig-Holstein, so rich in funds, an old maid, far apart from German science, has collected and preserved prehistoric relics. In the Reich, the view first changed through the exceptional figure of the East Prussian Cosina, who researched German prehistory and supported it in a thorough work in 1895 in such a manner that it is today and for a long time will remain part of European knowledge. He was followed by the Viennese professor Muck, the Swiss Hauser, and a large number of excellent researchers. I named a few of the best names at the beginning. They have surpassed the important and long-leading French and Scandinavian science, while England has already remained far behind for a few decades. But with a sigh, one still thinks of the lost time and finds without number which our humiliation and foolishness let slip. Even into our times it was considered smart to level grave mounds and to build roads with the old stones of the forefathers. The new knowledge, however, was already there, but it was so revolutionary that one considered it the illusions of outsiders, just good enough to fill the newspapers with mocking pictures of old Germanic men, and to evoke bearish laughter in clerical and classical circles. Whoever today studies prehistory must, however, relearn. He must change so much in his image of the world that pride, and perhaps pain as well, over the old concepts often hurt. But I believe that nobody can withdraw from that, and that truth and honour entreat everyone to gain a clear image of the state of our prehistory, just as one must care for the future of his folk if one wants to be fit for life. Today, there must no longer be any German who, due to poor education, thinks lowly of his ancestors. SS Leitheft, Year 10, Issue 10. How Did Our Ancestors Live? By Hans Friedrich Blunk. Part 2. The Cradle of Our Culture. The Neolithic Stone Age. The Neolithic Age, the time between 3000 and 1800 BC, brought the emergence of the first high blossoming time of culture on our soil. In the period one begins, at first clumsily, and then with higher art, to erect the massive graves in the north. In that period two folks merge together, from whom Germandom emerges, the stone monument peasants and the war axemen who invented the war chariot. Little attracts even the indifferent as much as the millennia-old grave mounds that decorate our land in the north. Even though the unholy time of the 19th century leveled the vast majority, mighty hills and stone placement still remain in order to give us a picture of what once had been. Today, there is probably nobody who has not, with silent reverence, walked past the grave sites of those with whom we have, of those whose blood and laws we carry within us. Those grave mounds of our ancestors are for the most part passage graves, mighty constructions from which it can be seen that they were the long-preserved sacred sites of mighty peasant clans, just like, for example, the Danehog or Slimpt, whose burial chambers alone offer space for many people. In part, they are individual graves set out in a much more simple manner that do not raise high over the ground. The burial artifacts of both genders are different, but the bones show hardly any differences. The time of burial is about the same. One concludes from this that the two related folks lived next to each other and eventually merged into one. That is also indicated because the grave artifacts have two different jewelry circles, which in the area from roughly southern Sweden to Hanover overlapped and united. The folk longer native to the area, which we call stone monument peasants, developed the mighty culture of the large stone grave constructions, the miracles of the north. Certainly, our ancestors were a seafaring folk, which in mighty military campaigns already 5,000 years ago penetrated into the yet unopened Atlantic seas and planted settlements and new folks along the coasts. But it also sent its columns over land across Europe. We find traces far into the south. The other portion, which contributed blood, essence, and word to the new formation of the Germanic region, was a folk that science names the braid potters after its unique decorations on clay pottery. That is known to us through its invention of the war chariot, and in which the majority of researchers think they see the most significant Indo-Germanic iron ancient folk. In each case, as I already said earlier, the origin of the Aryan folks must be put in Northern Europe, because the earliest books of the Indians and Persians still bear the memory of winter and winter solstice, because they tell us of the white skin, blondness, and blue-eyedness of the early ruling strata. A corporeality that, according to the universal judgment of our medical science, does not evolve in the south. Finally, because the Germanic words of the Aryan or Indo-Germanic languages also include the trees and animals of the north, while those of the south are diverse among them. So does the donkey, which is widespread in the south. In the Indo-Germanic, always having individual designations, but we find common words for winter: fog, snow, spring, meadow, alder, birch tree, beech tree, fern, otter, cap, beaver, hare, aurochs, bear and wolf, ermine, and 1,000 other concepts. Now in the third and second millennium of the Neolithic period, large land acquisition armies again take off from the folk community of the braid potters. They fill the regions previously only thinly covered by Nordic people and force their language upon them. Thrust by thrust, they go as far as Italy and Greece, and from them emerge the Celts, the Prutzen, the Illyrians, and the Thracians. Culture advanced mightily in this millennium. The splendidly polished Stone Age weapons were produced. Many domestic animals, whose domestication already started in the period of shell hoarding, were won for man. Most important, however, is that land cultivation began and expanded. The oldest plough of mankind was found from that period in a Frisian moor. The Bronze Age. The Bronze Age followed the second millennium before Christ, the golden age of the new Germanic folk of the north that had grown into a unity. The casting of the new metal is found earlier in the south than by us. A thorough examination of German bronze pieces for traces of other metals has, however, shown without doubt that they are tin and copper from Germany. There were mines in central Germany that are today not economically practical. Chemistry proves that the metal alloys come from them, whereas the bronze of the south displays totally different alloys. In the Bronze Age, the filling of the whole of Europe with Indo-Germanic folks which had started in earlier millennia, was essentially completed. The emigrants largely adopted the cultures of the original natives that they found and further developed them, but their superiority is so great that they impose their language almost everywhere. Four cultures existed in the Bronze Age on the soil of the present Reich landscape. In the north, there were, as already portrayed in the Neolithic Age, the pre Germanic people, who had emerged from both folks and now grew toward their mission. They rapidly out advanced their neighbors, enriched them with the products of their blacksmiths, who advanced to even the most artistic musical instruments of old times, the luren, an S-shaped horn with decorative disc at the end. Next to Germanic Man and farther to the south, the Celtic culture had developed, whose Nordic foundation and close relation to Germanic Man is without doubt. In the east, in Thuringia, it borders on a third, the Illyrian culture. That culture had nothing to do with the later Slavs. The Baltic folks were a fourth group, who, like Celts and Illyrians as well, were of Aryan origin. Germanic Man, Celts, and Illyrian made significant accomplishments in bronze work, but Germanic Man had the leadership. Only in Greece are equal artists found in those centuries. Germanic Man also had the time and leisure for it. After the earlier wandering movement of the Indo-Germanic folks, a long period of peace ruled in Europe's north. There is fighting in the Mediterranean. Troy and Crete are destroyed. Egypt is threatened by Indo-Germanic maritime folks of the north and the Etruscan lands in Italy. In the Germanic north, on the other hand, the people of the Bronze Age live in a golden age. The climate is continental, has warm, bright summers and cold winters. The oak domains, the hills with its elm and linden, cattle breeding and crop cultivation achieve a high blossoming, and house gardens bring the first hybrid apples. The land is densely settled. Clan order, social form and laws correspond to those of all early Indo-Germanic people. A high weaving and decoration art elevates the folk over the neighbours. An old religion gives it festivals to which one travels over the sea northward. The clearest image of life form of our Bronze Age ancestors would be a comparison with the early Greeks before the spread of writing and the stone house. One should remember that all of this begins around the year 2000 BC, hence 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar, before Solomon's empire, 1,200 years before the foundation of Rome. But lost forever is the history of that time in the north. Only massive kings' graves and the finds of a high life culture still tell of it. The Iron Age. The Ice Age follows, the last age of prehistory, which stretches from about 800 BC to actually the present. Around 800 BC, the climate in the Germanic settlement lands starts to change. The warmth recedes, and the air becomes more moist. That brings difficult changes into the life form of our Bronze Age ancestors, who have perhaps become more accustomed to an all too opulent life. At the same time, a new metal, iron, starts its march to victory. Already the king's grave of Sedin in the Mark, which may have been built around 1000 BC, contains a needle and a punch made of iron. The first iron finds on the Nile come from an earlier time, and those in Crete probably around 1200 BC. we must reckon with the probability that the earliest use of iron did not lie in our hands, but the blacksmiths, the forges that we primarily find in Westphalia are as old as the iron finds themselves. So if one took the use of iron from another folk, one immediately started producing it oneself. The very old word steel, which passed into several languages, stems from the Germanic language. The Iron Age, hence roughly the last millennium before Christ, brings advances and retrogressions. The potter develops the turning pottery wheel, the production of glass jewellery, and the gold plating of metal are discovered. But in blacksmithing, the accomplishments of the Bronze Age, it seems, are not reached again. The golden age of Germanic prehistory is over. Only much later will a new blossoming of artistic achievement evolve. In southern Germany, the Celts have their great time from about 900 to 390 BC until Brennus advances before Rome. They win half of Europe. In the west, all of France, Spain, and Britain, but they do not expand against the Germanic north. In the Neolithic age until the time of Christ, the artistic mastery of the Celts, which we can admire in the excavation at Latena, is amazing. Their fortifications indicate heavily populated states that held out until Caesar's time. Germanic Man had, for almost a millennium, sat peacefully in his old settlement area between southern Sweden and lower Germany. He only slowly set into motion. At the end of the Bronze Age, he had reached the upper Weser in the west and crossed the Rhine. In the south, they are good neighbours with the related Celts. The Kimbers and Teutons still appeared to have crossed their territory on the basis of peaceful agreements. Then, with the decline of the Celtic folk around 500 BC, the men of the north advance more aggressively and win and settle in the course of a few centuries the whole southern Germans in the region of the Alps. They must have, as the name giving proves, aside from the smallest remnants, replaced or driven out the Celts, almost without trace the previous inhabitants, withdrawn before Hermanduren, Sueven, Chatten, and Alemannen. In Caesar's time, Ariovist already stands across from the Roman commander in Alsace. In the east, Germanic advance appears to have started at the beginning of the Iron Age. In the Weichsel area, one finds early Scandinavian tribes who had come across the sea. The old border between the Illyrians and Germanic Man that ran through eastern Pomerania collapses. The Illyrians withdraw before Germanic Man, who already around 200 BC, as Skiren and Bastarnen, reaches the Black Sea. Along the same path follow later the Goths, Vandals, and Gepidden. The Bronze Age was the epoch of highest cultural blossoming of Germandom. In the Iron Age, the hero's age of the Germanic folks, their powerful campaigns take possession of the present Reich territory, and they settle the strips of land bordering the Reich in the east down to the Crimea. From this time onward, Germandom determines the countenance of Central Europe. The more we become acquainted with our ancestors, then more proudly can we refer to them. However, the greater becomes our duty to prove ourselves worthy of them. SS Lightheft, Year 10, Issue 11.